first because we're moving into the Aorist. So we're going to talk about roots a little bit and do some review, some new thoughts, and then come into dealing with first and second Aorist. And if you notice on page 7, the lexical study, I give you vocabulary of first Aorist and second Aorist. And first Aorist, you'll notice the sigma alpha. You'll notice a couple of them where the absence of the sigma, like I sent out, your second word there in first Aorist, I sent out. You'll notice that the sigma is missing, but that's because liquids and sigmas don't go together, so sigma drops out, and we have that compensatory lengthening. On the right-hand side, second Aorist, you won't see the sigma alpha present anywhere. And so we'll talk about that tonight. And then I have a diagram on page 5. We'll talk about a little bit about it. And because of the seemingly oddity of second Aorist is why we're going to go back and look at roots first and then come in and talk about how to form the Aorist tense. So if you have lesson 12 open to page 4, we'll start looking at that. And then if you have your Appendix A, lesson 12, I completely forgot I had these. And I was sending stuff to Warren, and all of a sudden I went back and was like, oh yeah, I really did do that. So basically what this is just elaboration on Appendix A, dealing with the future. And it's interesting, the future system, have future active and middle, and talk about the fact that the aorist subjunctive and the future, they share similarities. And it's interesting because in poetry, in some of the dialects, there's no external difference between the future indicative and aorist subjunctive. There are times when you'll see the form, it looks exactly the same, and you'll have to determine by context. But it's interesting because if you think about it, is that you can have aorist reflecting something in a subjunctive, what might happen, right? Same thing with the future, looking to the future, something that might happen. So both of them can express the idea of probability or possibility of something happening, and they can both reflect something in the future. So what I did was went through and I looked at some of the changes that happen. We've looked at before some new principles here. And then on page 2 of Appendix A, I have the first Aorist, the sigma system, and then a walk through the second Aorist. So this is just added extra study stuff you can look through for yourself. What I try to do is with the grammar itself, the lessons were like the bare essentials. What do you need to know to really get into, start using the Greek and operating? And then I started doing appendices to add on of just further study, further thought to take you down the line. So you won't get bored. You'll have something to get you going further. And then the Appendix B for lesson 12, the uses of the imperfect. We've talked about the imperfect a little bit, that it's continuous action, but I give you, starting on page 1 at the bottom, talk about the different functions of the imperfect tense and give you some examples from Scripture. So this will give you an idea of what it looks like. And so I'm going to keep trying to do that, keep trying to add these to the lessons. And as time goes on, my father's doing that now. He met with Wallace today about the Greek grammar, which hopefully things are going to, some doors are going to open. But what he did was he did the similar thing. He did his base part of his grammar, and then he's just going to keep adding notes on, and people can just keep compiling and taking further study. So what we have in the grammar for us is just the basics, and then everything else is just further study and so on. And I'd like to compile more notes on the usages of present and future and those kinds of things and the nuances, and so hopefully we'll be able to do that as we go. So those are just to add on at the end of lesson 12. But tonight we're going to look at, start with roots, and then we're going to talk about verbs, and then we're going to get into the aorist. And we have to backtrack a little bit, and then we'll talk about the aorist and that. Because essentially when we get to the aorist tense, we're talking about, like, we really are talking about the grassroots of the language. And this is what started, I think, for my dad in a lot of ways, is beginning with the aorist and showing how everything began from the grassroots and built out from that. And that's sort of what started him on this journey. And what started was interesting. In seminary, he took Greek, advanced Greek, with Dr. Robert Thomas. And he had to take, part of their class assignment was to take A.T. Robertson's historical grammar, which is a massive tome. He had to take that and they had to outline the grammar. That was a part of their class project. The process of it, though, as my dad was reading through it, was realizing where A.T. Robertson was coming from, the historical roots, and looking at language from a lexical perspective, and so on. And so that's really what started the journey for my dad, and that's what led him into doing his doctoral work on comparative linguistics and that. So, but everything starts with the roots. When we look at prepositions, the roots, the base meaning of the preposition, work out from that. So as much as we can, that's what we do with Greek, is just keep going back where the grassroots of tense, whatever it is, and work out from that and let context define for us the parameters of how far we can or cannot go with things. And that's a great, safe way to approach even just studying Scripture, because we want to be objective, not subjective. We want to draw from the text the meaning, not reading an understanding or a meaning into it. And this is a good way to do that if we start with how we handle language and then work from there. So roots, we started looking at and talked about the fact that roots represent the original stock, which other words as a rule came from, they developed from. And essentially, according to A.T. Robertson, there are about 400, maybe less, root words, and everything else is built off of this. Tells you how amazing the Greek system is as communicating, because you have this root core base of words, not a whole lot, but how much you can develop from that just by the different endings, whether it's nouns or verbs or so on, and how we then can combine and build words. And we find a lot of those hapax legomena, those once spoken words in the New Testament. Oftentimes Paul will coin a word because he can't find one. There isn't one in extra biblical Greek. There isn't anything in Scripture, Septuagint, that he makes a word. But we can see how almost there's a fluidity with the Greek language on how you can make terms as you go along and build them. But essentially there's that base grouping of 400. And so basically then when you look at Metzger's work, that little thin book, it's just a sampling, and he suggests that it's just a sampling of some of the roots that are there. There's more that you will learn as you go along, but those are the majority of the time you'll find those ones, and so those are good ones to master. It doesn't seem possible to distinguish between verbal or nominal roots. Same thing like with English, we have the word work can be both a verb and a noun. It's the same idea with Greek. Essentially, it's hard to tell which one came first. Likely verbs, but it's hard to tell sometimes because they shared a similar base and similar blocks from which they built from. But if you just look at the language and development, and even we look at the augment put on the front of secondary tenses, the augment is essentially an adverb that's attached to the front of the word, and so we can see these developments of the language. So if you look at adjectives, they're the variations of nouns and pronouns. When we get to the participle, it's a verbal noun. So there's verbal elements that go with participles, there's noun elements. So we'll come all the way back to declensions again when we get to participles. And so all of this, you just see these building blocks that develop and build the language, which is so amazing to me because it is so precise. It's so precise. Which then when you look at the Old Testament, you look at the Hebrew, there's a foreshadowing, there's setting the foundation, and then you have the New Testament that's all about fulfillment. You have promise here and then fulfillment over here. You have the shadows and figures and so on present Old Testament, and then you have the refining and the defining of things in New Testament. And so you have a very pictorial language in Hebrew, but then you come to Greek and it's so precise in what it communicates. And you see the beautiful truth of what God is doing. I don't know what to tell you, but work with it. So then we have the adverbs. They're mixed case forms of nouns and adjectives and pronouns. The language just keeps developing. Prepositions were adverbs used with nouns and then with verbs, and then conjunctions. They were adverbs used to connect words, sentences, and variations. So we can see the development of the language, and all of these things have the root base, and that is the roots themselves. And we can see a lot of the roots going back to Indo-Germanic stock. I'll give you an example, and this is one we use often, but dik is to show or to point. And there's a lot of terms like righteousness, justice, and so on that are developed off of this root. Our word dictionary comes from this. But you can look at Sanskrit has dikami, and Latin, diko, indica, We have the different developments. We can see the relationship of this family of languages and the connection that's there. Gothic and then Germanic, and we'll skip by those two. But so we can see the roots of this, and that's the beauty of why we approach the language that we do, is because we realize, one, it's not dead like Latin is, but it's a part of a family, and we can see the development that happens through the language, and it helps us to understand the movements that were happening, the changes that were happening, and many carry over into the modern Greek in that. But we can see with the thematic skep or skeptomai, the Sanskrit, we have spas or spak, which is to look or to spy. This carries over into Zend and Latin. We can see these roots that are related, that carry on through the language. You can see this with Latin, and you can see it with Italian and Spanish and so on. You can see these roots that are carried around through the different languages. And the more languages you learn, the more you'll start picking up on these roots that are fragmented throughout these various languages that are all part of the same family. And then we have Greek, where we have metathesis that happens with Greek. And so we have from spec becomes skep. And so we have the interesting passage we have in 1 Timothy chapter 3, talking about elders and those who desire to be episkopes, right? It's from this term here. It is overseer. So epi is upon, and then skopes is to look over. And so that is what the term is literally overseership. Bishop is a really poor translation because it's misleading. But it's that idea of what is the function of an elder. And that's what that reflects. Then presbyteros reflects the maturity that's involved in the ministry. So both terms focus on the same ministry, but from different aspects. But that episkopes focuses on the overseer, the watchful care over. But we see this root that runs all the way through from Zen to Latin to Sanskrit to Greek and on. And we can also then, we see it in English carry over into spy. So we can see then the development of the language. We can use the same root for various things. We can add prepositions on the front. We can add the alpha privative, which negates it. We can make it unjust. We can make them verbs, nouns, whatever, but it all starts with that root. So when we get to aorist, it's unfortunate because aorist, we're dealing with it down here, and most grammars do, but it's actually, that's where everything started from. And then the interesting thing is that we'll have first aorist, which people think, well, that's the true aorist, and then second aorist. Actually, second aorist is the true aorist. First aorist is a development off of that. So aorist takes us back to the grassroots of the language. And again, once we start to understand these roots and get them down, we can start formulating terms and understanding them as we run through there. And you'll start seeing these connections. It's interesting, I mean, even with Brandon now, it's like watching, he's picking up as he reads through different passages, starts to see those roots and stems as they come. And this is all it is. So we carry it over into nouns, the same thing. We start with these triliteral root or the stem. We add their endings on of here, and then we can have the alpha privative on the front, and we have guileless, leavenless, powerless. Building blocks. Start with the root, whether we have the fixtures for the nouns or the verbs, but that's what determines it, and adjectives and so on. And then we can start compiling terms. So we can take the term for good and well, euangelion is the good news, the gospel. And I like this. Really, we should translate it that way, I think, sometimes. Literally in Acts, when it talks about Paul and Barnabas, they went about gospelizing people. I think it's such a great translation, but we don't do it that way. Eudokion, we have good thinking or pleasure. We have eulogia, which is praise or blessing, eulogy. And we have that at the beginning of Ephesians chapter 1, verse 3. 3 times we have the verb form, and we have the noun form built off of this. And Eucharistia, which is thanksgiving, the Eucharist for the Thanksgiving. So again, we just see these building blocks. We start compiling together, and we built these terms up, nouns, verbs, what have you. So let's look at the verbs then. We looked at classification of Greek verbs. 3 essential ones that we look at. There's actually 4, but we look at the regular verb luo, and that's what everything is built off of, and that's what the chart is for, the regular verb. We have the indicative, and then everything below the line, subjunctive, imperative, infinitive, participle. Right now we're only dealing with the indicative. Above the line is what we've been focusing on, and we'll drop below the line when we come back after break. Then we have the irregular verbs. And those we'll deal with at the end in contract verbs. But they won't be as confusing, especially having started the way we started and talked about the roots of the language in that. So irregular verbs, contract verbs, and the me verbs oftentimes throw people for a loop because it's like you have all of these things happening, but they all make sense when you understand what's going on with the language, and they won't be so confusing. And this is where everything started. We started with the aorist, the, sta, da, and me. And so here we have, basically we have the. These are our roots. This is really the aorist. This is second aorist. And then everything then developed off of this. So the me verbs were the first, then came the omega verbs, but everything started here with the second aorist essentially. And we also have, first perfect, second perfect, but we don't get into those things. And then we just add the endings on. So if I want to put it in present tense, tithe me, I place. If we want to put it middle or passive instead of the active, we can put my at the end, and we put off from myself or lay aside from myself. And so this is where the endings start coming in, active, middle, and passive endings. And we can see the development then, right? The me to the my, it's just the alpha in between those two letters. And so we can see these roots. We'll see this when we get into your Greek text. You'll see many of these terms that are there, but these are the original ones that we started off with, and the omegas came later. And then essentially we have our verb endings, and these are the things to concentrate on. Me, ct, mente, nt, and then our middle and passive, my, si, tai, metha, essa, and tai. Those are the things to memorize. Forget the lists, just get these endings, and then we start picking our terms apart. And we can see the development of the history of the language. You started with the parent language, the Indo-European, that moves into the Sanskrit, carries it over, Bahami, Bahasi, Bahati, which then moves into the primary Greek, me, ct, and then it moves into the Latin. And then from this we saw that the primary tenses move into the secondary tenses. So our endings, essentially they came from the primaries and they take it over into secondary. The mu becomes a nu, the sigma loses the iota, the tau ends up dropping out, and that's where our secondary endings come from. So some of this stuff, it would do you well that after going through some of this to go watch some of my dad's morphology stuff, and all of a sudden other pieces will start falling into place. And essentially that's what happened with his morphology class. It really took its roots when guys were coming out of, say, Bible college. They took basic Greek, they learned it the traditional way, and then he came in and he just redid it for them and retaught them. And so it was good because they had sort of a base to work from, but then all of a sudden when he went back and retaught them, then he at least had some, material to work with in their minds. They already had stuff going. So his morphology is really good for if you've already had some sense of Greek already, and then go in that and watch, because then all of a sudden it'll just start.
Is that on YouTube?
Yeah, yeah.
Is it under his name, or?
It's under the same channel that we have this class on. So it should be on the Pyramid Ministries, on that channel, yeah. I think that Brandon set it up for a password. So if you look and see and it needs a password, just contact me and I'll send you the password. But I think you should be able to access it. But it's his whole year-long class on Greek morphology. And that's all it is just basically reteaching guys. So it's what he did for years. It's really what he did when I took beginning Greek. I mean, he's just the one who took me and walked me through it in a couple months, and I gave me the basics, and then I walked through there and took the class at seminary after that. So all these then just build off of. So secondary tenses come off primary tenses. There's that relationship that goes on, but then there's a different significance when it comes to the tenses, imperfect, aorist, and pluperfect, and how they function. That's where the difference comes. But the plural forms are nice because they really don't change a whole lot. So once you get the plural forms down, then they'll be grounded in your head and you'll see those all the time. That's nice because that takes some work out of it for you. So it's just the singulars. It's the same thing when we looked at first declension. Because first declension, you had these variations that happened in the singular, but the plural is always the same. right? And it's the same form for everything else. So those are the easiest. Get those down, and then the others sort of piece in as you go along. So essentially we're going to look at the aorist, and this is where we deal with time: imperfect, aorist, pluperfect. Those are the only ones that have the augment on the front. Below the line, there's no time. So when we deal with subjunctive, imperative, infinitive, and participle, there isn't any time involved. So keep that in mind then, because when you have participles, where they gain their time from, or their sense of reality from, is from the finite verb. So if you look at Ephesians 1:4, that's the first finite verb that we have, that God chose us in Him before the foundation of the world. That's the only finite verb to that whole section. The rest are participles. So then your participles are going to take cues from the other verbs in the context. And therefore, if there's a time element that goes with those participles, it will come with whatever they're associated with. So let's spend our time. We're going to look at aorist tense, talk about the aorist a little bit. I want to look at form and function. So we're going to try and fit both of those in the time that we have. And essentially, this is where we started: action occurring. It's a simple statement of fact. This is where everything started. And we said if we could sort of symbolize the aorist tense as just a dot, punctiliar. It's a statement of something that happened. But there's different ways to look at that. So you can have a statement of fact about a single event, or you can have a statement of fact about something that took a period of years. And both of them can take the aorist tense. Context will tell you how, and then there's different ways and aspects. We'll look at that at the end on how to see the aorist and how it functions. And then we have action continuing, and this is present tense, and then action completed. This is the perfect tense. And so essentially with the aorist, we have punctiliar, the dot. With the present tense, we have the line, which is linear, continuous action. And then when you get down to action completed, that's perfect tense. It's a combination of both of them. It's the punctiliar, something happened and the results continue. And so that's the progression of it. And these are the basics, essentially, when we look at the tenses and how they function: action occurring, action continuous, action complete. So action continuous, every time I find a present, a future, or an imperfect, they all fall in this category of continuous action. So whether it's continuous action in past time, continuous action in the future, or continuous action, whether it's present, or we can have the present for something eternal. So look at Colossians chapter 1, verse 17, that He is before all things. That is, there is atemporal. It's talking about His eternal existence, being before all things. So again, just keep that in mind, that all three of those look at continuous action, but the different aspects of it will be determined by context. So aorist tense, it's interesting where the word comes from. It means without limits or undefined. And it's made up of two things: or alpha privative, which negates it. So there's two things. It's the only letter that really in the Greek language, the one letter that has meaning by itself. So you have an alpha privative or an alpha copulative. Example of alpha privative is this: aoristos. It puts the without limits on here, undefined. If you have an alpha copulative, it's on the word adelphos, which is the word for brother. Delphos is from delphus, meaning of the womb, and then alpha copulative on the front of it means the fellowship of the womb, and therefore, i.e., brothers, sisters, and so on. So there's two different ways in which the alpha can be utilized. In this case, it's negated, and it's connected to the word haristos, harizo, which we actually get the word predestined from. So this is the root or the stem for predestination. It is to separate, to mark off by boundaries. And that's what essentially what Paul describes in 1:4 of Ephesians, that God chose us in Him before the foundation of the world. Verse 5 then explains how He did that, the manner in which He did that. He marked us off by boundaries. There was everyone who would ever exist in every generation for all of time, in eternity past, God marked us off. And that's how He selected us. He marked us off by boundaries. And so essentially this is the makeup of the word, and it means then, which is nice, it's just undefined action. It's a statement of fact. So just keep that in mind, because we can have an aorist tense be used of something in the future and something in the past. And it can be a long period of time, a short period of time. Context will determine that for us. But just keep in mind, this is its roots, undefined action. And the present tense is punctiliar, point of action, because the fundamental function of the aorist tense is to note action is simply occurring. So it presents the action as attained. It states the fact of the action or the event without regard to its duration. And as a matter of fact, it can involve something that took 46 years, such as the building of the temple, or it can take all of mankind, all of sin, sum it up in one statement: all have sinned. Right? And that's the beauty of it, but we have to start thinking that way. And that's important, because what happens is you'll read commentaries and they'll just say everything is just, it's a simple past tense. Usually it's like we represent with ed on a word, right? But it's more than that. It's more significant than that. And so we've got to keep those root ideas in mind, especially when we start studying through the passages. And then the aorist then takes the augment because it's a secondary tense. So imperfect, aorist, and pluperfect are the only ones that have augment. Everything else doesn't reflect time. So we have aorist active, aorist middle, and aorist passive all have the augment on the front of it. And that's one of the cues that tell us what it is. One of the keys that we unlock the doors for. So formation of aorist tense. This is a different way of looking at the secondary suffixes. We have the active endings, singular and passive. Nu, which actually came from mu. Sigma, which came from si. And then we have the tau, which ends up dropping out. It's like, so it's similar to French, because they don't pronounce a T at the end of a word. So my friend's named Dan Tebow. But if you look at it, so a professor in seminary one time was calling roll and he said Dan Thibault. Well, that's what it looks like. It ends with a T, but it's French, Thibault. And it don't pronounce the T at the end. So essentially it's the same thing with Greek, that you have a lot of these words that have the T at the end. It's not pronounced, it just dropped off, right? Because remember, we're talking about phonetics. That's what governs the signs and symbols. And because they don't say it, why write it? All right, essentially, if we break it down. So it just eventually gets dropped off the end. And the reason for the brackets is then oftentimes then there will be a movable nu sometimes put on those words that would take that ending. Then we have the plural forms, men, te, n, or san, and n and san came from nu tau. And nu tau is interesting because we'll find nu tau in participles. We find the roots of it here, so we can see the development of from the verb to the participle taking on the verbal and noun aspects, and also taking on some of these markers. So you'll learn when we get to participles, nu tau tells me it's an active participle. So originally, this is how the aorist was formed. We put an augment on the front of our root, and then these are the endings. And essentially, there wasn't an alpha. There wasn't a connecting vowel. It just basically had your sigma, which indicated an aorist, and then you had your ending, mu, sigma, tau, and then you had men, te, and nti. And that's what originally what it looked like. And then as it progressed, there was the variable vowel, the connecting vowel that went between the tense stem and the suffix that's ended on the end, and that's where the alpha came. And the alpha became so associated with the aorist that essentially that's how we see it as, although the alpha is a connecting vowel, we just connect it with the sigma and say that's the tense stem, sigma alpha. And that distinguishes it from the future, which was the sigma. But this is essentially what the roots of it look like in the early years. And then we can see the development of it happening. So if we aorist active indicative, then as we see it in the Greek text, we have our root, we have our augment placed on the front, and then we have our sigma alpha. And again, this is joining the connecting vowel plus the tense stem, the sigma. It's just like with the perfect, kappa alpha is essentially, it's a given, that's the perfect tense stem. And this is a simple aorist active indicative. Elusa, elusas, eluse, elusa. And then for the plural, men, te, right? San. So elusa, elusas, eluse, elusa, men, elusa, te, elusan. So if we pick it apart, take the augment off, tells us secondary tense, likely past. Sigma alpha tells me it's aorist, and then whether there's an ending on there, men, te, or san, tells me if it's singular or plural. That tells me if it's first person, second person, third person, and then on down the line. So here's the thing that's interesting then. When we get to the aorist, this is where we get to the first aorist and second aorist. So there are some words in English where all we do to indicate past time is just put the ed on, right? So if I do I preach, I preached. Simple past tense. So in some senses that's the aorist with the sigma alpha. But some English words change within the confines of the word. So if I take the word teach and I want to make it past tense, it's taught, right? So then there's a change within the body of the word itself. That's essentially the second aorist. And we'll find that to make a present, things are added. To make an aorist, things change within the heart of the word. So sigma alpha is the simplest, in a sense, the simplest form of aorist. And then we have the second aorist, which is the changing. So the differences between preach, preached, first aorist, teach, taught, second aorist. But essentially, second aorist is what was the roots of the language. So basically, for some Greek verbs, we're just going to merely add sigma alpha to the stem, and others, we're going to alter the heart of it. We need to keep in mind, though, when you see them, they're exactly the same. Both of them are aorist. So the function in context are exactly the same. The form just looks different, is all it is. It's the same thing when we look at the middle and passive, whether we're looking at it depending on what tenses, if it's aorist or present or so on. The element of voice doesn't change. It's the same whatever we look at, right? It's the same thing with aorist when we look at the different forms. So let's make it. So we have the verb stem, then we have the tense stem, which is sigma alpha, and then the connecting vowel. And essentially this is a combination of the two. So for forming the aorist, there's really only 4 elements necessary. The verb stem, the tense stem, sigma alpha, and that's connecting the connecting vowel. And then we have the verbal suffix, the endings that go with it, and that's how we form the aorist. And these are our endings for our secondary tenses. The singular and plural, nu, sigma, non, that's the movable nu. And again, oftentimes you'll find that movable nu because you have, so the word will end with sigma epsilon se. So because it ends with that epsilon, and if it follows by a word that starts with a vowel, sometimes that movable nu will be there. And that's one of the reasons or ways in which we understand and know how it's being used. And then the plural forms men, tet, and or san. And then we have our augment, which is placed on the front of this. So let's look at the breakdown of this. The augment, syllabic augment, temporal augment. Both of them function in the sense of how they're attached. The syllabic augment is essentially if the word begins with a consonant, you just put the epsilon on there. Like elusa, right? It's lu, begins with a consonant, you put the epsilon on the front, that's our augment. Epsilon doesn't change, stays just like it is. If I have a word that begins with a vowel then what it's going to do is going to cause that vowel to change. And it's basically contraction. You have the epsilon plus whatever vowel's there, they combine together, and it's going to take a lengthened form. And so I refer you back to lesson 12 and that diagram I gave of the vowels to look at. But essentially that's what it's going to do, is just lengthen the vowel. So second aorist usually lies nearest to the root of the word and forms the basal verb root. In other words, the original root of the Greek verb was preserved in the second aorist. It's where it started, and then that's where it's basically hung on as we move through the language. So second aorist, active, indicative. So here's the word montano. Now this is the word you'll find in the dictionary. So if you look up in your dictionary or lexicon and you look, you'll find montano. This is what you'll find, but that's not the root of it. The root is mat. But this is the present tense. So I'll show you what happens. This right here, this nu, it's inserted here to make it a present tense. And then ano is the suffix that's added to also make it a present tense. So the ma and the theta, that's the triliteral root of the word. And so basically this is your present tense of it. Nasal infix, ano ending. Same thing with lambano, nasal infix, and then you have your ano ending. And there's a lot of verbs like that. But here is the aorist. So this is second aorist. It's built off the triliteral root. So this is where you're going to really start to see those roots that Metzger gives in his book. This is where you'll find them with the second aorist. But this is where it all started. So here's my augment on the front. This is my ending right here. Nu sigma, right? Non. So this is my first person singular. And then this is my triliteral root, and this is connecting vowel here. So the root of which is mat, which forms the basis for mate tuo. So here we find this is our triliteral root right here. I make a disciple, and then mate tes, disciple or learner. Right? So tense stem then is the first aorist, is usually takes the form adding the sigma alpha. So this is the simplest form of the aorist. If you have essentially your root, begins with a consonant, takes the epsilon, and then you have sigma alpha, elusa, and that's the first aorist. And that's the simplest form. And you'll find quite a few of those in the Greek text. If you look on page 5, I'll give you some examples of the different examples of the second aorist and how they're built. So if you look on there, you have present tense lambano, I take. Elabon, I took. Your triliteral root, lab. Right? And then I try to put some English derivatives so you can get a sense of how we borrowed it from there, but labyrinth. Pasco, I suffer, that's your present tense. Epatan, I suffered, and then pat is your verbal root. And it's interesting, if you look at I flee, piugo, that's interesting because you have that epsilon in the end there, but if you look at the aorist tense, it's just pug. The epsilon isn't there. So there's an infix of the epsilon there for present tense. And then you have the triliteral root of it. So that is the second aorist essentially, but first aorist is simple. You have the augment, then you have the sigma alpha. Now, what's interesting is that we come across words like this one here, and I'll give you an example in your notes. You have it there, but we have angelo, right? The stem is angel. That's where we get angel from, messenger, right? So our stem is angel. The first aorist, we put our epsilon on the front, right? So epsilon and alpha become an eta, right? So that's our augment. But notice this. This tells me something happened, right? Tells me that we lost the letter and there was compensation for it. Here's my alpha. What got lost was my sigma. Right? So essentially it was, this was lengthened to an eta. Epsilon is joined, lengthened to an eta. Sigma alpha is attached to here. Liquids and sigmas don't go together. Sigma drops out, compensatory lengthening, and this is what we wind up with. You can find a lot of terms like this, right? You see those, you'll know that. So alpha after the liquid, and then you have compensatory lengthening, you know that there's a sigma that was lost. So this last example then we see liquids and sigmas don't go together, compensatory lengthening, and therefore we have our non-spurious diphthong. Function of the aorist. Any questions so far on the forming of it? So the simplest thing, and this is interesting because the simplest formation of the aorist is with the augment and the sigma alpha. But that's the later development of the aorist, which is intriguing. So essentially what we see that even with the development of the language, there was a refining. There was a simplification of the process. But second aorist was the very beginning of it all. That was the grassroots of it. But it helps us then with the augment and the sigma alpha. The function of the aorist, and this can come in different ways, and I'll probably have to do this. I think that I can see if I did anything on, no. I think in our notes we only did, I elaborated on the imperfect usage and not the aorist usage, yeah. Because I don't think in our grammar I didn't do a whole lot on the usage of the imperfect. So I might give some more examples, do an appendix for the aorist and how it functions, how it's used. But here's just some examples. So chief kinds of action, we have punctiliar, And this is the aorist. It's just a simple dot. And then we have the protracted, or what some grammarians refer to as linear or durative. That's the continuous. That's the present tense. That's the imperfect. That's the future. That's just ongoing action. And there's different ways to reflect that continuous action. So we can look at it as a simple line. It can be a broken line. So we can see that something is an ongoing event, a state of existence. So you can have that reflected in the perfect tense, stand in the state of being, or you can have a present tense reflecting that, right? That example from Colossians chapter 1, verse 17, he is before all things, showing his preeminence. That is, it's just a solid line if we were to visualize it. It's just his eternal existence, his supremacy over everything, is what Paul is trying to communicate there. So we can have this sense of state of existence either with present or perfect. The reason why the present is used there, not the perfect, because he didn't enter into that state and then stay in that state. He's always been preeminent, right? Because he's eternal, he is God the Son, and so therefore that makes sense why he does it that way. So just keep that in mind, that can be used that way. And then we have the repeated action or frequentative, and this is usually something habitual. Paul talks about his prayer life. He'll oftentimes use present tense. I'm continuously praying for you. Doesn't mean he's, every single moment of the day he's praying, but it does reflect that prayer without ceasing, right? He'll have certain prayer times during the day, but throughout the day he'll pray as he walks, as he works. As he does that, he will pray for people in the church. And of course, he had a long list of all these people he prayed for, but he shows that this was a habitual action for him. And there are other things that we're called on to do, like when we're challenged to become imitators of, present tense, make a habit of. Shows two things. One, that you haven't gotten there yet. Two, it's something that's contrary to nature. It's something that we have to work into, and it's something that we need to make a habit of, right? So there are good habits to develop, bad habits to develop, but present tense helps reflect that. And then we have the perfective, and there are two different ways to look at this, a perfect tense. And this is the usual way, is that something happened in the past, the results continue. So we look at Scripture, and Scripture, we have the word Paul likes gegraptai. It stands in the state of being written. It was written, and then the results of that writtenness continue on. The other way to look at it is this way. It looks at the process leading up to and the final end. So we can have Paul's statement in 2 Timothy, I have fought the good fight, right? I have kept the faith. He is looking back over his life and seeing this long course, and he's being brought to a completion at the end before he dies. So that is the nuances of the perfect. So keep those in mind when we look at that. But these are essentially the key elements or key actions of the Greek verb, punctiliar, protracted, and then perfective. So examples in English then, to release is punctiliar, released is also punctiliar, and then releasing is linear, and then he was releasing is also linear. So one is looking at a simple verb, the other is participles. Participles can reflect this exact same ideas, either punctiliar or continuous action. And aorist can be viewed from different points of perspective. So this is interesting, concept aorist. This is what happens. Concept aorist is talking about when we sum up a whole bunch of elements. So it can be years, so 40 some odd years building a temple, that's a concept aorist. It looks at it as a singular, and it would translate it built. But it's looking at something that took over a period of 40 some odd years, but a statement of fact it was built. And I'll give you some, I'm going to go through and I'll do an appendix for these, because some of these you have to see them, and the theological truth that's behind some of these statements is pretty amazing. And then we have the ingressive aorist. Ingressive aorist looks at the initiation into a state of existence. And so this is the starting point. I've entered into this state, and then it's reflected. And then the culminative aorist is this, where it's a culmination of something. So it could be that something happened over a period of time, and this is the final result of it, and aorist tense will be used for that. So again, the shadowing of it is really significant. Start with the basic idea of just a statement of fact, and let context and define for you the different shades that are involved in that. But that's the beauty of the aorist. To just say that it's simply a passive thing, it's just merely reflected by ED, is not sufficient to the aorist. But that's usually what we're taught when we come to the aorist tense. It's just a statement of simple historical fact, but that's not always the case. And you'll have times where it's looking at something in the future, like Mary's song. She is looking to the future, but everything she states is in the aorist tense as Luke records it down for us. And the reason for that is that it is so sure God's going to accomplish it that it can be stated as something that's already happened, but it's still future. So same thing when Paul deals with the issue of what God has done. In Romans chapter 8, he predestined us, right? And so on, justified. And the last one, glorified. All of them are aorist. Glorified is also aorist, but it's still future. But it is so sure it's a part of that eternal chain that is spoken of as having already been accomplished. But it's looking at the future element. So I'll go back and put an appendix together on different ways in which these things flesh out in the text and what they look like in that. But this is essentially the aorist tense. So if you want, I go back through and the examples I give, the formation of it on page 6. At the top there, we have the first aorist and then the second aorist and the examples. And the lexical study, I did this because essentially if these are just words that you'll find often in the Greek text. So if you want to go through those, at least get a grasp of those ones and the way that they look. So at least, and I try to do that when I did the grammar, is that essentially if you walk through the grammar and learn the vocabulary at the end of the various lessons, you'll have a pretty good grasp of the New Testament vocabulary. I mean, at least you'll be able to really start interacting with a lot of the passages and go from there, and at least give you the building blocks, and you can use Metzger's work after that. Questions? It's a flood, I know. So next time when we come back, I'll see if I'm going to try and do some things in between here and when we come back, and I'll just post them online. I'll text you and everyone else and let them know. What I might do is